Hello students, and welcome to the discussion video for Sunday Summary Week 4. This one here was, not surprisingly, fairly concentrated on affirmative action. Most of the submissions came in on the example which Michael Sandel used about college admissions and the recent Supreme Court decisions that have altered the way affirmative action can be applied at the state level when it relates to post-secondary education in particular. Let's get started with Dan. And I'm going to use Dan because he didn't specifically relate the affirmative action decisions about college regulation, but he rather related it to the hiring practices of the New York Fire Department. Let's listen to what Dan has to say.
I chose this topic because I find affirmative action to be a huge issue in the country right now, especially in the hiring of public servants such as firefighters and cops. It played a major role in me getting a job as well. I do think diversity is a good thing and I'm all for it, but I believe earning a job should be based on merit and skill rather than the color of skin or gender. The article I've chosen is about New York's fire department and the battle they have been fighting for many years. That battle is the many lawsuits and complaints against their hiring process, which people state is biased towards African Americans, minorities, and females. Many African Americans and other minorities have either not passed or achieved a high enough score to be hired, and in turn many more white firefighters have been hired instead. A few judges in the tri-state area have halted the FDNY's hiring process recently and insisted that they change their test to better accommodate minorities and female applicants. They also put in writing that the FDNY must hire many of the minority applicants from the past, giving them back pay and retroactive seniority. So the judge basically ordered FDNY to hire many of the minority applicants who either failed the test or did poorly on it in the past. In part, this will also punish white firefighters who did well on the test, costing them seniority. The decision is unethical to give people jobs who have not earned them over the people that have perhaps studied and worked harder. Now, don't get me wrong, I work with many African Americans, minorities, and female firefighters that do the job very well and some instances do the job better than me. And I'm all for diversity, but I don't believe in affirmative action. I think it should be based on merit.
Now, what you have to remember about Dan's example is that everybody has an opinion on affirmative action. So nobody's neutral in this. And this is what the dilemma is, and this is why Michael Sandel used it to such great effect in his video, is that because everybody does have a dog in this fight, everybody will have a strong opinion, and there will be very few people who are neutral on the issue. Now, Abresha, I hope I say her name right, Abresha, has... she did not give me an audio file, so I can't play her audio file. But what I can do is I can read what Abrisha wrote. She wrote, in episode 9, Arguing Affirmative Action, the 1996 court case of Cheryl Hopwood is brought up and how she had the same grades, if not better, than minority students. Her statement was, I'm just being turned down because I am white, in which case it was true. This is Abrisha saying this. Her rights, I believe, were violated. A student in the audience defends affirmative action, saying that there are discrepancies in education and naturally whites do better because they have better opportunities and better facilities to further one's education. She, the person in the audience of Dr. Sandel's class, she says it isn't fair that minorities don't receive an equivalent education because of social and economic problems. Now, Abresha was correct in citing the two sides of this argument. Abresha did not agree with the affirmative action being applied in this case, but she at least provided an argument about what somebody in the lecture hall said in response to that when it was brought up. Mei Li also did not agree with the idea of affirmative action being applied where a more qualified white person may be denied access to a college in order to provide access to a minority. Here's Mei Li's comments.
My article is about Supreme Court. They actually they allowed states to ban affirmative action if they want to, last year in April. Who was hurt by this decision? I guess minorities would say they were hurt by the decision because in a way I can see them saying that now they have less of a chance of getting in. Who benefited unfairly? Again, the minorities. If you look at it in the perspective of them thinking that they're not going to be able to come get into a specific college because of their race. Although, if a white person were to be denied entrance into a college because they're white and they need, the school needs to fill a quota to get more minorities and they're rejected because of that, that's unfair to the white person. I think that it should be only based off of your school background, your educational background, and that's it. I don't think that it should be based off of race at all.
In this story that May Lee provided me with as her hyperlink, it talks about the Supreme Court decision coming down 6-2 with Elena Kagan recusing herself from the case because she had been involved with this case at a federal court level when she was a judge. So Sotomayor wrote the dissenting opinion for the two that went against it. She said, in this quote here, "The white majority is rigging the rules of the game to ensure its perpetual success." And I love this little cartoon which I pulled off the internet, where the white people are standing up on top of this cliff and the minority person is down here standing on a box that says affirmative action to perhaps give them a leg up on climbing this cliff so that they can be at the same level as the white person. This is what Justice Sotomayor is talking about. This is what anybody who argues for affirmative action is arguing for. This is the argument that Lyndon B. Johnson himself made when he mentioned that you can't take a man out of chains and put him on the starting line and expect him to perform as well as everybody else who has been training all of their life for the race and has had every advantage to be in that race and very competitive in the race. And these people that you just take out of chains, let's put them on the starting line and say, okay, you're on your own, off you go. So the affirmative action is nothing more than just a little box to try and climb this cliff, and it's to give a leg up on this cliff. This is the way it was designed, but this is not the way the white majority see it. The white majority have an ethical problem in many, many cases. And that's what Chapter 2 is going to deal with today, and we're going to get into that a little bit in this lecture here, but in a little more depth as you read this week's assignment on Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 in the Johnson textbook. What the white majority see when they only choose to see it from their angle, through their lens, and how it affects their lives, is what this boy here is saying in this cartoon. Wow, those SAT questions were brutal. What did you think? And the minority young man here says, well, I got the one where I check off my ethnicity, so I know I aced it. So we've got these two sides of this argument. It's an ethical dilemma. Is it an ethical obligation to favor the minority? So that's the question we're going to ask here. So let's hear what David had to say on his submission. He used a story about Harvard and University of North Carolina to illustrate his point.
Who was hurt by this decision? Depending on what angle you're coming from, you could say non-African American students are being hurt because African American students have a better chance and how they're graded. But I'm coming from a different angle. I think to do away from affirmative action would hurt African American students because it's a need. Non-African American students would benefit by doing away with affirmative action, mainly because it's kind of monopolizing admissions to non-African American students.
So what David argued here was that Harvard is not doing anything wrong by what they're doing. What Harvard's goal is to get a balance of diversity, because Harvard appreciates the value that a diverse student body adds to the learning environment. It's not about academics. It's not about whether the white student is more qualified than the minority student. For Harvard and many, many highly ethical post-secondary institutions, it's not about letting the most qualified students in. It's about providing a rich environment on campus. But what privileged white folks want to argue whenever they feel their daughter or son was slighted by this decision-making process is that it's only about the SAT score. It's about that academic score that says my child is more intelligent than your child. and they should be in Harvard because they're more intelligent. Well, Harvard is saying, no, that's not how we make our decisions. And the same thing for University of North Carolina. Both of these institutions are saying, we don't make our decisions that way. We make our decisions so that we have a diverse student body, because in that environment, our students learn more about how to improve society. If everybody was all male, and if everybody was all white, and if everybody was all Christian, and we were still discriminating against letting females into these institutions, we tried that, and it wasn't successful. It wasn't desirable. Affirmative action, if you read up on the history, has done more for females, white females, than any other segment of the population. Affirmative action has created an environment where diversity is seen as desirable and achievable. So it's not racial balancing, as the plaintiffs argue in this lawsuit that David illustrates. It's a conscientious effort to bring diversity into the institution. As Harvard says, then and now, the college considers each applicant through an individualized, holistic review, having the goal of creating a vibrant academic community that exposes students to a wide range of differences. So affirmative action is not all bad. Unless, of course, you are a privileged white person that's getting good grades and somebody who doesn't look like you gets in instead of you. And then all of a sudden it's bad, because then it applies to your life. The story that Matt looked into was about funding for the New York public school system, specifically in schools that served minority and disadvantaged populations. And they got their hands slapped for not doing enough for these students. And so let's hear Matt.
My article this week is about the disparity in New York City school district funding between different districts, mainly based on students of color. I thought it went well with the reading, just because it went with episode 9, part 1 of the Sandel lectures, that the critics of affirmative action, as well as the advantages of the family we're born into. The advantages of the family we're born into, I believe that it relates there because kind of where you were born, it really wasn't your choice. It's an arbitrary factor. If you're born into a bad neighborhood, you're going to be stuck in a worse education system, and it's kind of a shame that the city is funding these schools less, when in the article it says they need about 2.3 times the funding more than the wealthier districts. So the kids are really the ones that are being hurt, as well as all people of color in general, because this is going to be not just a one generation thing. It will affect multiple generations if it hasn't, which it most likely has already. So it's been unfair to them as well. I think only people who are going to benefit are the wealthier, middle class and upper class. I hope the school board in New York City does figure this out. I hope they intervene in a good way, because they do have $5.5 billion in the state of New York to distribute among schools. And obviously these poverty schools, especially in the city, should be getting more funding than the nicer areas in uptown Manhattan and so forth.
So what we find out from Matt's story here is that the complaints of discrimination were based on deep disparities between poor and minority students and their more advantaged peers. What they found in this study was that in order to balance the education outcomes, spending per student needed to be 2.3 times higher in these disadvantaged schools in order to bring them up to par. So if we don't want to deal with affirmative action at the college level, and obviously the white majority does not want to do that, the alternative is to spend more on these students while they're in elementary school, middle school, and high school. And on one study it says up to 2.3 times more per student. And that would balance it out. So I think what everybody who came down arguing against affirmative action has forgotten is, I think they've forgotten the John Rawls philosophy that he called the veil of ignorance. What were you supposed to do for the veil of ignorance? You were supposed to imagine a world where you could land up anywhere in that world by an accident of birth. You are not born yet. You go backwards to the point before you were born, and you say to yourself, if I were to land in the most disadvantaged population in society, what would I want the regulations of society to look like? So let's go through a few examples here. The Little Rock Nine. This is 1957. The National Guard had to be called in order to desegregate the schools. 9 African American students were to be admitted to Little Rock Central High School. And it was almost all-out war. It was 3 years after the tepid Brown versus Board of Education decision in which the Supreme Court said, yeah, you know what, we don't like segregated schools, but we're not going to put a deadline on when it has to be enacted. But to have segregated schools is unconstitutional, and we're not going to tell you how to fix it. So it took 3 years after the Brown versus Board of Education decision before this high school and this town and this school district decided to actually abide by the ruling, because the Supreme Court didn't give any guidance on when it had to be enforced. So, if you apply Rawls' veil of ignorance to this situation, what if this man was your grandfather? If you were to be born into a station in life, and you knew that you were going to be this man's grandson or granddaughter, and you were going to sit on this man's lap and hear the story about how the National Guard had to be called in so that you could attend the high school closest to your home, would you still want affirmative action? Affirmative action came into play shortly after this event. Was affirmative action needed? Is it still needed today? Well, let's go a little further. In Chapter 2, you're going to deal with a topic called unhealthy motivation. When Johnson refers to shadows, he's talking about leaders who do not abide by good ethical decision-making processes. They're casting shadows instead of casting light. Some of the things that cast shadows are these 6 monsters that he talks about. Monster number 2 is particular in this case, I think, for the Little Rock 9. He talks about a battleground mentality. Affirmative action could be likened to a battleground mentality. It's me versus you. I am a white male with really good grades, and you don't have the grades that are the same as mine, but you got into an Ivy League school and I didn't. So it's a battleground now, because you got something that I had earned. So this is what was outside of Little Rock Central High School on the day that the Little Rock 9 were admitted and accompanied into the high school by the National Guard. Race mixing is communism. Stop the race mixing. This is the march of the Antichrist. You can't get any more confrontational than that. This is a battleground mentality. If you win anything, that means I lost something, because the only way you can gain is if you take it from me. That's how people approach affirmative action. They see it that way because unethical leaders have presented it that way. Turning immoral conduct into moral conduct. Immoral conduct is characterized by 7 points in these next 3 slides that we're going to deal with. You make a moral justification for your immoral conduct. Leaders persuade themselves that their harmful behavior is actually moral and beneficial. Or you give it a euphemistic label. Euphemistic language has a sanitizing function. It makes harmful behavior appear more respectable, and it reduces personal responsibility out of the equation. An advantageous comparison or false equivalency. This contrast involves comparing unethical or criminal acts with even worse activities, thus making them appear more tolerable. While affirmative action isn't as bad as something else. But 4 and 5 are my favorites. Number 4 is the displacement of responsibility. These individuals, these unethical individuals who are behaving immorally, these individuals often put the blame on someone else so as to minimize their responsibility for doing damage to others. So, I am a privileged white male with very good grades applying to a university or applying to become a fireman, and I'm not against minorities. I have no personal animosity towards minorities, but all I want is I want the job that I'm more qualified for, because my credentials tell the evaluating system in place that I should be hired because I'm more qualified, as if that were the only qualification for the fire department. That's what they used in Ferguson, Missouri. Ferguson, Missouri used the argument that we hired the most qualified policeman. Well, what was the outcome in Ferguson, Missouri when they said, we hired the most qualified policeman? That system is so easily rigged. Well, you advertise in an area where you're only going to get white applicants. Corporations do this all the time. They know where to advertise so that they don't get minorities applying. And so they get this pool of people applying for the policing positions in Ferguson because they didn't advertise anywhere where a person of my color would even have applied or even seen the ad to apply. So the outcome was disparate. They call it disparate outcomes when you're investigating affirmative action complaints. The outcome was that you had 3 police officers in the entire police force in Ferguson that were non-white. But you were policing a community that was 75% or 80% or 70% black. So should you have been hiring the most qualified individuals, even given the fact that if you had advertised very, very effectively everywhere, should you still have been only hiring the individuals who had the highest qualifications? Considering who this policeman would be policing, considering who this police force has to deal with on a daily basis when they go out and do good, effective policing. No, you would want to hire a police force that looks like the population that you're policing. If you're a fire department, you want your staff, your firemen, to look like the population that you serve. It's just like policing. If you respond more quickly to a certain zip code than you do to another zip code, and your entire fire department looks like the population at that zip code where you respond in 2 minutes, and there's hardly anybody on your fire department that looks like the population from this zip code where you respond in 14 minutes. Should your only interest be the qualifications of the individual? Or should you be looking at having a fire department that looks like your population that you serve? The onus of affirmative action is to say, you know what, I'm going to hire a workforce that looks like the population I serve, and if they are underqualified, then I'm going to bring their qualifications up to the standards that I expect. But my highest priority is that my workforce look like my population that I serve. Diffusion of responsibility is spreading out the responsibility so that it lessens the personal accountability for immoral behavior. Well, I didn't make those hiring decisions. This is the way the regulations were written. I didn't write the regulations. Somebody else wrote the regulations. It's their fault that we have this policy in place. I'm just carrying out the policy. You diffuse the responsibility to somebody else. And the other thing which happens out of number 4 and 5 there is that you get to blame your grandparents for the current problems here in the United States. So back in 1841, it was perfectly acceptable for people to be up north finding lone black males, even if they were free men, and kidnapping them and taking them south of the Mason-Dixon line so that they could be sold as slaves. Well, this person didn't have any papers. Well, it didn't matter if he had papers or not. They were kidnapping them because they could be sold for money. He was a commodity. This person had been dehumanized. Even though he was a free person, a free man in the North, he would have had no rights in the South. So that was a very awful period in American history. But what is the connection between Solomon Northup and a black student today who's applying to get into Harvard? Can you draw a line between this behavior and the fact that perhaps the minority applicants to Yale and Harvard and University of North Carolina and University of Michigan have marks that aren't quite up to the standards of everybody else that's white and came from privileged private schools and charter schools? I can draw the connection. I'm just asking you if you can draw the connection. So if you were doing Rawls' Veil of Ignorance, if you were descended from slaves, in what year precisely would you say that the United States became a post-racial society? If you're arguing from an ethical perspective for that affirmative action should be abolished, I want you to point me to the year, the specific year, between Solomon Northup and this young black man who's applying to Harvard or Yale today. I want you to point me to a year and say that's the year we became post-racial. That's the year when this young black man applying to Harvard had an equal chance in every regard all of his life from the time he was born until he's applying at Harvard. John Rawls asks you to do that because John Rawls wants you to think, would I be indifferent to being born black in the year 1992 or being born white in 1992? If you can't put ideas into place that will help that black young man born in 1992 in every way so that you would be content being that black male, then you need to rethink your philosophy about affirmative action. Because if you would prefer to be white, then we still need affirmative action, or something like it, something that will substitute for it. Point number 6 is dehumanizing of the minority. And point number 7 is an attribution of blame. Well, we can blame others. We can blame our grandparents. Our grandparents, our great-great-grandparents, our ancestors incorporated slavery into the history of the United States. But thankfully, we no longer have that, so I don't have to worry about it. Now get rid of this affirmative action because it's standing in my way. Well, if you've got a problem with the inequality in society, then you're saying, in a John Rawls mentality, that you would have a problem being that person that you think is getting a disadvantaged regulation or getting a preferred, that you have a problem with the person that's getting a preferred treatment for their application into an Ivy League college. Dehumanization is also connected to something a little more recent in our past than slavery. And the attribution of blame is a little closer to home than 6 or 7 generations ago. This picture is taken in a town about 30 miles from where my husband lived and was raised. My husband was raised in Muncie, Indiana. This picture, this lynching, was the last lynching in the northern states, and it took place in 1930 in August. My husband's mother was 13 years old, and her pastor went and retrieved these bodies so that they could have a proper burial. He had to sneak in and he had to talk to individuals in order to get the bodies. And he got the bodies out of Marion, he brought them back and was preparing them for burial in Muncie, where he was an undertaker. Well, everybody who lynched these boys wanted to now come down to Muncie and get those bodies back because their intent was so malicious that they wanted these bodies buried in unmarked graves. The community found out that the men from Marion, Indiana were coming down to retrieve the bodies and kill the undertaker, the pastor. And so the black men grabbed whatever they could, whatever guns they had. They were on the rooftops of all of the buildings surrounding this chapel. And my husband's mother lived a few blocks from the chapel, and she was 13 years old, just a few years younger than these boys hanging on these trees. These boys have names. Their names are Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith. How would your mother raise you if your mother had been 13 years old on that terrible, terrifying night when white men from another town were coming in to kill your pastor, kill anybody else that got in their way so that they could take the bodies and just throw them in a hole in the ground? Well, let me tell you how much it shaped my husband's life. My husband's mother was old enough to be your grandmother. On John Rawls' Veil of Ignorance, what if your own grandmother told you this story of when her pastor brought these bodies home for a proper burial? How would that grandmother have treated your father if your father looked just like one of these boys? How would that mother have raised your father? Knowing that the policeman who had arrested these boys abandoned the jail so that they could knock a hole in the wall of the jail to get the boys out of the safety of their cell. So you have this problem with affirmative action. Affirmative action is so much more than getting into college or getting the job on the fire department. Affirmative action is compensating in whatever way it can to say, you know what, we need to start putting minority youth into positions where they are on an equal playing field with white youth. Because they have this in their history, it is still an unlevel playing field. And it is not long ago history. This is the history of parents in the case of Little Rock 9, and grandparents in the case of lynchings in the United States. So being born in 1992 does not mark there's not a point in 1991 that says, oh, okay, we're now a post-racial society because we got Bill Clinton elected from Arkansas and he's kind of like our first black president. There's no line in the sand that says, oh, okay, black youth born today are very different. This is Miami Northwestern Senior High School. When I was doing my research and was working with the Neighborhood Leadership Study Circle, I was working at the Tukulsi Center, which is just 9 blocks south of Miami Northwestern Senior High. Now, is this high school the same as a high school in Weston, or a high school in Coconut Springs, or a high school in Coral Gables? No, it's not. Youth who attend this high school do not have the same advantages of youth who attend in a white suburban neighborhood, and they do not have the advantages of youth who went to a private school, and they do not have the advantages of even going to a charter school. This is the public school that is in the Liberty City neighborhood of Miami. Let me tell you a little bit about the Liberty City neighborhood in Miami. Up here in the top corner of this picture, behind that blue line, is what they call the Liberty Square Project. That blue line marks a segregation wall that dates this neighborhood back to a segregated South. This neighborhood, where the high school is, was a white neighborhood, and the people living there said, no, you're not going to build Liberty Square there without keeping them segregated from us. We want a wall. So this is Northwest 12th Avenue now, and if you drive down Northwest 12th Avenue, you can look down at the right side of the road and still see the footing of the segregation wall. Now, there has never been any white people living in the area around Miami Northwestern. So how do you give these students an equal footing when they apply for college or university? That's what affirmative action is there for. So on Rawls' veil of ignorance, would you want that Liberty Square is still a housing development today where people live? Families are still raising babies in Liberty Square. If you had the benefit of Rawls' veil of ignorance, you would ask yourself, what policies would I put into place in the Liberty City neighborhood just in case I'm born to a family that lives in Liberty Square? And if you don't put policies into place that take advantage of that person, then you are ignoring Rawls and what he said. So this should be these ideas and these thoughts should be constant in your mind as you read chapters 1 and 2 of the Johnson textbook. This is the importance of watching the Michael Sandel videos before you started the Johnson textbook, because you need to have a full grasp of these ideas, and you need to look at yourself and ask yourself, have I forgotten how much privilege I have? If indeed you feel you do. I know I do. I was raised in a white community. I never saw a black person until I was 12 years old, 13 years old. It was a very sheltered environment. The school might as well have been a private school because everybody was on the same religion as me. Everybody had the same color skin as I did. And everybody lived in middle class homes, and everybody's family drove nice new cars. I recognize my privilege. I reframe everything I see in the world the way John Rawls tells me to. Because as a public administrator, as a person who studies public administration, as a person who teaches others how to be ethical in their dealings with others so that social equity becomes the goal, so that there's a proactive effort to make social equity happen, that's important. And that's what this textbook is about. Okay, so now we can ask ourselves, how long will we need affirmative action? Well, I agree with the students who said that it seems unfair that somebody who is less qualified than me would get the job as a fireman, or who is less qualified than me that would get admitted to an Ivy League university. That on its face does seem unfair. It goes against what we've argued and what we've seen Michael Sandel argue. So what can we replace it with? We still need something, because as Sotomayor said, and she's right, and I agree with her, and I don't think there's anybody out there that wouldn't agree with her that has investigated this to any degree, it's to be understood that the white majority is rigging the rules of the game to ensure its perpetual success. We have a class of privileged people who have enjoyed privilege all of their lives that are very reluctant to give it up, and people are out there framing this as a war, as a battlefield, that if somebody else gains something, then I've lost something. So what do we replace affirmative action with? Well, Professor Harris, who teaches at Duke University, is arguing that we can base it on wealth. We don't need to worry about race or ethnicity. We need to base it on how much wealth does a family have. If you are coming from a poor family, then you need affirmative action to bring you up to a position where you are on a level playing field with somebody who came from a privileged family. Somebody who could afford a private school, somebody who could afford to drive their child across the city to a charter school, somebody who had a wife or a husband staying at home so that they were there so that they could take them to drama school and after-school football practice and give them all of these wonderful niceties in life that a family that has to have two incomes just to buy groceries never has. So you can't live in the nice suburbs with the nice schools if you can't even afford a car. So you live in the inner city where the transit is good, where you can get a bus to get you to work. And if you didn't inherit anything from your grandparents, then there's no trust fund available to give to your children so that they can pay $30,000 a year in tuition. So a university that has $30,000 a year tuition is going to have to offer a scholarship to a high-achieving student who's in a disadvantaged situation. And this is what Professor Harris is talking about. If one concedes that wealth determines opportunities, then one must also concede that blacks and Hispanics do not have the same opportunities as their white counterparts. And I'm going to leave it there, and I encourage you to keep this thought always at the front of your mind as you're reading chapter 1 and 2. And that's why it was so important for us to have the Michael Sandel lectures before we get into this textbook. Enjoy your reading. Thanks.